Hello, this is Mary Collardita, and I'm always looking at how to know God's will, how to do God's will, how to follow God's will, how to know it's His will. And He shows us, first He always did by His word, by His spoken word, through prophets and teachers and leaders, and then through the written word. You had to write it down. So we're going to look at Esther chapter 2, and I'm going to read it. So after this, when King Xerxes' wrath had cooled down, he thought over what Queen Vashti had done and what had been decreed against her. Well, Queen Vashti, the story is that the king had a banquet. King Xerxes of Persia, this is Persia, was also known as Ahasuerus. Well, he had a banquet. I think it lasted about 7 days, maybe. I think I talked about, there's another little reflection that I did in the book of Esther. Anyways, he had a banquet. She refused to come when she was called. He wanted to present her to the important men of his kingdom. She didn't come because she was having a banquet, and she disrespected the king. That set the men like, oh, you can't let her get away with this. You know, if she disrespects you, the king, what are our wives gonna do? And so what he ended up doing was banishing her. I like what it says right here. This is in chapter 1. Thus, when the decree that the king will issue is published throughout his realm, vast as it is, all wives will honor their husbands, from the greatest to the least. This proposal pleased the king and the officials, and the king acted on the advice of Memucan. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, to the effect that every man should be lord in his own home. If you have ever heard, a man is king in his own house, he's king of the house. Well, this is exactly where this comes from. So, going back to this, I'll just start over. After this, King Xerxes' wrath, which had cooled, he thought over what Vashti had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's personal attendant suggested, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint emissaries in all the provinces of his realm to gather all beautiful young virgins into the harem in the royal precinct of Susa, under the care of the royal eunuch Haggai, guardian of the women. Let cosmetics be given them. Then the young woman who pleases the king shall reign in place of Vashti. This suggestion pleased the king, and he acted accordingly. There was in the royal precinct of Susa a certain Jew named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been exiled from Jerusalem with the captives taken from Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had deported. He became the foster father to his cousin Hadassah, that is, to Esther, when she lost both father and mother. The young woman was beautifully formed and lovely to behold. On the death of her mother and father, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. When the king's order and decree had been proclaimed and many young women brought together to the royal precinct of Susa under the care of Haggai, Esther also was brought in to the royal palace under the care of Haggai, guardian of the women. The young woman pleased him and won his favor. Esther pleased Haggai, the guardian of the women. So he promptly furnished her with cosmetics and provisions. Then, choosing 7 maids for her from the royal palace, he transferred both her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not reveal her nationality or family, for Mordecai had commanded her not to do so. Day by day, Mordecai would walk about in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was faring and what was to become of her. After the 12 months preparation decreed for the women, each one went in turn to visit King Xerxes. During this period of beautifying treatment, 6 months were spent with oil of myrrh, and the other 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. Then when each one was to visit the king, she was allowed to take with her from the harem to the royal palace whatever she chose. She would go in the evening and return in the morning to a second harem under the care of the royal eunuch, Sheshgaz, guardian of the concubines. She could not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and had her summoned by name. As for Esther, daughter of Abihail, an adopted daughter of his nephew Mordecai, when her turn came to visit the king, she did not ask for anything but what the royal eunuch, Haggai, guardian of the woman, suggested, and she won the admiration of all who saw her. Esther was led to King Xerxes in his palace in the 10th month, Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and of all the virgins, she won his favor and goodwill. So he placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast in honor of Esther to all his officials and servants, granting a holiday to the provinces and bestowing gifts with royal generosity. As was said, from the time the virgins had been brought together and while Mordecai was passing his time at the king's gate, Esther had not revealed her family or nationality because Mordecai had told her not to, and Esther continued to follow Mordecai's instructions, just as she had when she was being brought up by him. During the time that Mordecai spent at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the royal eunuchs who guarded the entrance, became angry and plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. When the plot became known to Mordecai, he told Queen Esther, who in turn informed the king in Mordecai's name. The matter was investigated and verified, and both of them were impaled on stakes. This was written in the annals in the king's presence. So, a little bit of a summary. Queen Vashti was banished from King Xerxes, and so the king ordered all the beautiful women, or the virgins, to be presented to him. Now, Mordecai, who was a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, had raised his beautiful niece Esther as his adopted daughter. Now, when Esther was chosen to be presented, to be one of these virgins, she was given special treatment by Haggai, who was a eunuch, and he was the head or the guardian of the women. Now, Esther always obeyed, followed the instructions of Mordecai and then of Haggai, who was the head of the women, the guardian. Now, when Esther was brought before the king, he was attracted to her, and then he made her queen. Now, later on, Mordecai had heard two men plot against the king to assassinate him. So he went and told Esther, who then told the king, and Esther credited Mordecai with revealing the plot. So, first off, we know about Vashti, and the thing was, she disrespected the king. And we know that the king has a harem of beautiful women. They begin as virgins, but then, when they're prepared after a year of preparation to learn the, traits of being beautiful, of perfumes and cosmetics and all of probably a lot more other things, they are brought in at night to lay with the king. Now, Esther was among these virgins, and the main instruction she had been given by Mordecai was that she was not to reveal that she was a Jew. She was to keep that hidden. So the thing about Esther that's mentioned a few times, besides her being beautiful, is that she listens and follows instructions. She listened and followed Mordecai. She listened and followed Haggai, guardian of the women, and she listened and followed the eunuch who was the head of the concubines. We can't configure that because that's her nature. Now, Mordecai knows that if Esther is in the harem of the king, that means he's gonna sleep with her. Could even, have children by her. Now, that's probably a concern because this is a pagan man, a pagan guy. This is not a Jew. He's Persian. So Mordecai has to trust God with his adopted daughter, his niece. He has to trust that God has a place for her. And whatever happens, let it be God's will. So there's two things about Esther. Number one, it's said that she is beautiful, beautifully formed, and what was the other word? Lovely to behold. But she also had a beautiful spirit. She had a beautiful nature. And I can think that it is her beautiful nature that supersedes her beauty in the flesh. And the reason I think this, because it says the king was attracted to her. Because she was beautiful, she was you look at a bunch of beautiful women, they all what do you call that? Miss America pageant or any of those. They all seem quite beautiful. But the key to Esther was her beautiful spirit. remember, it was Vashti's disrespect and rebellion, not wanting to follow guidance, not wanting to follow instructions, but do her own thing. You know, she wanted to, she was having a banquet, and why should she come? But that's not the spirit of Esther. Esther was willing to listen and follow. That is key. Now so going back to the king was, I think he might have been a pretty decent king, because he listened to the advice of the men at the court. You know, and it reasoned with him. And you think about it, because it says right in the beginning that first he was really angry, but when his wrath had cooled, he thought over about what Vashti had done and his decree. So he was a thoughtful man. The other thing about him is that he has a certain respect for the women in his harem. He allows them a whole year to be prepared. You know, he's not ravaging and raping and doing evil, wicked things. And then when he does choose Esther to be his queen, it says here, he placed he made her queen, but then he had a great feast in honor of Esther with all of his officials and servants. And he calls for a holiday, and he bestows gifts to people with royal generosity. So this tells us that this king cared about his people, and he celebrated with his whole kingdom. Pretty good guy. So this tells us that let's think about how does this relate to us, and we're going to look at women in particular. So women should be submissive. Remember, I think as Paul says, women, submit to your husbands. Honor them. Be respectful. Serve them. Follow their advice. Let them be the head. Queen Vashti needed to let the king just be the king. You know, do not be proud. Humble yourself before the Lord, and he will lift you up in due time. This is a great example of someone who was humble, and the Lord raised her up. And you might think, well, why would he raise her up in a pagan kingdom, you know? Well, we know later on why he does. Why she was called to be in that place. And so in our lives, my goodness, we need to trust how the Lord leads and be faithful. You know, Esther wasn't told to do wicked and evil things. We may have looked at it and said that would be wrong and evil. You know, she was taught to beautify herself and wear cosmetics and perfumes. And she did. So that meant that, you know, well, why would it be wrong and evil for us, but not for her? Well, difference, no. And I'm going to say something else, which I think is a little bit, it could be controversial. But I think God intends for women to be, well, all people to be humble, but for women to be submissive, you know, to learn. It's the same with all of us when we have someone in authority. To listen, to obey, to do what is right and righteous. But I think God also intends us to be beautiful. Now, I don't think I mean, we're not supposed to glory in our beauty and in the flesh. But I think God intended for women to be beautiful and for men to be strong and leaders and women to be, you know. And why I'm saying this is because there is a huge, huge pull in our country and in the world today to women have been dishonored by men and by themselves when they disavow their womanhood and when they do not take care of themselves and be the, you know, the beauty of a woman, to look and act beautifully, and to care for themselves as the women that God created them to be. We know oftentimes there's many examples in Scripture, Old Testament, where they were called beautiful. Sarah was beautiful. Rachel was beautiful. Leah was beautiful. He didn't think she was as, you know, pretty as Rachel, but so they were beautiful, beautiful in the outward and in the inward. But probably Esther is one that was most trusting in God, that if I do and I obey and I'm submissive and I do what is right. Remember, submissiveness is not to do evil and to do wicked. No. Then you have to take a stand, you know, but to do what is right and honorable in God's eyes. So if you're a woman and you think, oh, I just, you know, so many women have tended to look like men, it's not a good thing. And we need to, and also cultures that demean women, not a good thing. The Lord calls us to be strong in our goodness in the Lord. Remember later on, Queen Esther is going to go before the king without being called. And she knows that to do so is disrespecting him, and she could be banished, she could be killed. But she does it in obedience to Mordecai and to God's leading. So think about these things. You as women, be beautiful before the Lord in your spirit and in your body. And you as men, be respectful and caring and strong for the women in your life and those under your care, just like King Xerxes was. And trusting like Mordecai. Thank you for watching. Watch the other one too. Okay. Take care.